Today I wanted to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. If you started reading the book, you notice there is a challenge, which is the sentence length is very long. And you'll notice that Wollstonecraft tends to repeat herself. So similar challenges to the Locke reading. On the first part, on the first difficulty, I would say, every time you're reading one of these long paragraph length sentences, ask yourself, if I could cut out some of the wordiness, what would the main point of this sentence be? So you don't always have to get every single clause. You don't have to get every nuance or shade of meaning. What you need to get is the main point, the main point. And regarding the second difficulty, the difficulty of seeming repetition. Well, remember that one of the reasons that authors repeat themselves is that they consider the point they're making over and over again to be worth repeating. So they're saying to the reader, bear this in mind, I, the author of this book, think this point here is extremely important. And if they keep repeating certain keywords, like in Locke, we saw him repeating the word property a lot, for example. And that's how you knew property was like a huge deal for Locke. And in Wollstonecraft, you're going to see certain keywords come up again and again. For example, sex. For example, reason. For example, virtue. That's Wollstonecraft letting you all know that I've got some main points here, and I'm going to keep varying on these main points just to make sure that nobody can walk away from this book without that take-home message, without that 1, 2, 3 big set of points. Okay, I wanted to do two things today in this lecture. First, I wanted to introduce Wollstonecraft. The second thing I wanted to do is talk about how Wollstonecraft opposes women's oppression to women's rights. The rights referred to in the title of this book, the rights that Wollstonecraft is going to vindicate. And we'll talk a little bit about what that term vindication means. It's an 18th century term, and it's not all that used these days in contemporary American English. Okay, speaking of historical context, Mary Wollstonecraft lived in the 18th century, so about a century after Locke, and like Locke, English was her first language, and like Locke, she was English. So many UK and US feminists today recognize Mary Wollstonecraft as a kind of founding mother. Now, not all UK and US feminists make this acknowledgement. You know, if you're an ecological feminist, for example, there are probably figures like Val Plumwood who are more important for your thinking. Or if you're a socialist feminist, there's a feminist socialist canon. If you're an African-American feminist, you're probably more willing to recognize somebody like Sojourner Truth as a founding mother, and so on and so on. Feminism is a very big tent. Feminism is a huge tent. Not everyone actually even agrees what the basic meaning of feminism is, okay? Because some claim that feminism is about women's equality. Others claim it's about women's emancipation, which is somewhat of a more radical phrasing. Some claim that feminism is necessarily carried out by women. Some say that feminism is for everybody, men, women, all genders. are welcome. Okay, so there's lots of disagreements within feminism, but I think it's safe to say that for Mary Wollstonecraft, feminism has to do with something she calls women's emancipation. And then we'll talk about what that actually means. It's very strongly tied to women's rights, her idea of what women's rights are. And we think that we can say that Mary Wollstonecraft thought that women's emancipation had to be primarily carried out by women themselves, although men too would be involved. Men too would be involved. Okay, so that's just the sort of really broad overview of Wollstonecraft's feminism. The last thing I'll say here on this point is that feminism in Wollstonecraft's time did not exist as an organized social movement. There were not people who were self-identifying as feminism back in Wollstonecraft's time. If the word feminist was being used in the 18th century, and it was very infrequently being used, it was actually as a synonym to words like feminine, and other ideas regarding women's characteristics or women's cast of mind or their bodies or something like that, feminine. Okay, it wasn't until the 19th century that in countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, people started self-identifying as feminists, and you had an organized women's movement, and so on. Okay, so Wollstonecraft was really not in the mainstream. There was not a mainstream feminist movement back then that she could be a part of, and this is in part why many in the mainstream feminist movement today feel that there's a kind of debt and a sort of recognition of Wollstonecraft's stature. Wollstonecraft was unique, and this is once again part of the acknowledgement and recognition bit, in that she contested the power of men over women itself. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, the easiest way to explain this point is by way of contrast. Many women writers, and there were women writers prior to Wollstonecraft. There have always been women writing. There hasn't always been widespread women publishing, but there's always been women writing. Okay, but previous women writers had contested abuses of men's power over women. Wollstonecraft contested the power of men over women itself. So what's the distinction here? Well, if you look at a 17th century author like Mary Astle was living during Locke's time. And in fact, she was a big critic of Locke. What they were saying is the following. Mary Astle did not like Locke's argument that kings had limited power over their subjects. She was an absolutist. She thought kings had absolute power over their subjects. And you can imagine if this is the move she's making, she's also trying to say something about relations between husbands and wives. Because as we remember from our Robert Filmer, these absolutist types often compared power of kings to the power of patriarchs in the household. Okay, kings in the kingdom are like patriarchs in the household. Okay, and what Mary Astle said was, just like a king has absolute power over the subject, husbands do have absolute power over their wives. Okay, and what did this mean? Well, what it meant for Mary Astle is this is how God and nature intended things. Okay, obviously this is a huge oversimplification. There was also a lot of stuff in Mary Astle which was, for its time, very progressive. Like she was saying things like, well, you realize hardly any women are getting a proper education, and that women absolutely need to have their souls, their minds, and their bodies improved. Okay, so there's some progressive aspects of what Astle was saying, but when it came to traditional social hierarchies, Astle affirmed them. And then you can see Astle is kind of backed herself into a corner here, because if she's basically saying the power is absolute, aren't you basically authorizing these kings and these husbands to perpetrate all sorts of abuses? And this is where Assel says, no, 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 don't misunderstand me. What I'm saying is, it may be true God wants husbands to rule over wives and kings to rule over subjects, but it's the responsibility of the higher power, the one with more authority in the relationship, to not abuse their power, to make sure it's rightly exercised for the use of the subordinate party, and to make sure that there's a sort of just, I mean, in Platonic terms, it would be called something like guardianship, although Plato was more of a more gender equal when it came to guardianship. Okay, so that was Mary Astle, and Wollstonecraft just asked a very simple question. It was actually extremely simple, and in a way you can think of it as the analogs to Locke's. It was, is there anything in the nature, as in the natural body of a king, that makes them suited to naturally rule over another embodied person, the subject? Locke's answer was no. That was the whole point of the social contract. There's nothing natural about that relationship. And Wollstonecraft is saying the same thing. If there are relationships of inequality, and Wollstonecraft is more of an egalitarian than Locke on this note, within the household, does it have anything to do with the kinds of embodiment at play? And Wollstonecraft is going to say no. What she's going to say, if one person happens to be more reasonable and more capable of leadership and more capable of doing a certain job, then that person should be in charge of whatever the relevant thing in the household is. And if they're more suited to being cared over and being followed and so forth, that too has got nothing to do with their biological sex. Okay, and furthermore, Wollstonecraft is saying, so there's no inherent power of men over women just based on birth, just based on the body. And furthermore, Wollstonecraft is saying that's not even the ideal household arrangement. The ideal household arrangement is more egalitarian, at least between the adults. Okay, so that's where Wollstonecraft is going with some of this. Wollstonecraft lived an unconventional life. What was unconventional about Wollstonecraft's life? Well, for one thing, she was a woman writer who lived by her craft. She made a living writing. So yes, there have always been women writing, but those who were well known enough and engaged in the mainstream political, intellectual debates of their time, such that they could pay the rent and keep themselves food, clothed, and sheltered, and so on. That was a little more unusual. The other thing I wanted to say about the video was it shows how, for Wollstonecraft, the personal was the political. And what I mean by this, this is actually a 20th century feminist slogan, is that for Wollstonecraft, the household situation she grew up in, where there was basically a bad relationship between her father and mother. Father had a drinking problem. Mary considered her mother too willing to put up with it. For Wollstonecraft, that kind of situation, the situation that she and her husband, William Godwin, a very famous philosophical anarchist of the time, the relationship that Wollstonecraft and Godwin had, which was more equitable and more based on mutual respect, or even the relationship that she had with her one-time lover, Imlay, Gilbert Imlay, the American, which was, again, not a good one, and involved a certain kind of imbalance where Wollstonecraft thought Imlay had certain obligations as the father of their child, and Gimlay was basically trying to run for those obligations. All those situations were not just domestic relations for Wollstonecraft. Those were at the same time political relations. They were political relations because they involved, on the one side, morality. So for Wollstonecraft, she's always thinking in terms of rights and duties. Things that you have the freedom to do and the obligations that you have as the flip side of those freedoms. Okay, so morality is a big thing for Wollstonecraft. And then the other aspect of the politics of the household is power relations. Power relations, as we've already seen throughout this introduction, that Wollstonecraft was very concerned with having more egalitarian social relations. So the presumption in Wollstonecraft is against social hierarchy. The presumption for Wollstonecraft is against traditions that support hierarchies. And the presumption in Wollstonecraft is not only against husbands having power just by virtue of being male over their wives. That's not a sort of legitimate power. It was also over the power that aristocrats claimed over commoners. And speaking of Wollstonecraft's critique of ladies and lords and so forth, Wollstonecraft had a very acute fascination with the French Revolution. And much of the French revolutionary politics were against aristocratic rule, against monarchical rule, and the like. Okay, so that's the stuff she liked from the French Revolution. What else did she like from the French Revolution? She liked the fact that the French Revolution was forwarding this project or this promise of social equality more broadly. And this is more what's in the air than what Wollstonecraft herself is talking about, but it's a relevant historical context. So let me bring this up. So in the French Revolution, many groups in French society were for the first time mobilizing themselves, getting organized among themselves, and making political demands, not based on their individuality, but rather based on their group memberships. So this is especially clear as we'll talk about when we talk about Hannah Arendt, our last book, with the category of, well, basically lower class people, the poor, more bluntly. But this was also the case for women. So here is a picture of what has come to be known as in the history books as the Women's March on Versailles. The Women's March on Versailles. So one thing you notice here is that women, this whole frame here is filled with women, basically. These women are armed. There's even a cannon being pulled, and these women are, they're upset. They're upset that they are having a hard time feeding their families. So one of the things going on during the French Revolution is bread prices are spiraling out of control, and a lot of working class women and a lot of even middle class women were having a hard time putting the bread on the table. So the daily bread was under threat, and these women were marching on Versailles, the palace where King Louis and Marie Antoinette were holed up and scared and terrified, and you can see why. Okay, so this is a very interesting incident from the standpoint of gender politics, because the women, a lot of them were mothers, and they were getting involved in politics. They were getting involved in this march because they felt a certain obligation to put that bread on the dinner table. Yet at the same time, they were transgressing what were the traditional bounds of politics, which we've seen this idea, this more traditional masculine idea of politics, which is that it's a man's game, that it's for men, that it's carried out by men, that men would be the ones debating and making decisions and so forth. And you see women organizing for themselves. You see women arming themselves, and this is also not standard for the time, let's call it. Okay, so this was in the air. This was in the air. So there was a contradiction of sorts with the French Revolution. And the contradiction was pretty stark for Wollstonecraft, others who thought like her. What was the contradiction? The contradiction was the French revolutionaries were always going on and on about the rights of man. Yes, they talked about the rights of citizens, but the big idea for the French revolutionaries was the rights of man. And today we call these basically natural rights, and even more commonly, we call them human rights. Human rights. These are just human rights. These are rights you're supposed to have simply by virtue of being born. So in the old world, the time before the French Revolution, the idea of birth, saw this starting to get challenged in Locke, but the idea was birth was actually what made you unequal. Birth is what subordinated you to somebody else naturally, king and subject, for example, man over woman, for example. Okay, in Wollstonecraft's time, a new idea, and this was pretty radical. French Revolution has this idea. The Haitian Revolution has this idea. American Revolution has some version of this idea as well. The idea became nature is actually what makes you more equal. Nature is what makes you equal, actually. Okay, so the idea of the rights of man was a kind of egalitarian thing, and the idea is every individual, every human being has these rights simply by virtue of being born. Okay, but then Wollstonecraft had a very simple question. Why is it when you're talking about the rights of man, and you use this term, it seems to be generic, man, it would seem to refer to all of mankind. Why is it in all your usages of the right of man, you actually aren't referring to women? Why doesn't mankind include one half the human species? And that's basically what Wollstonecraft is asking on page 5. If you've got the Penguin edition, if you don't, just make sure you read that letter to the Bishop of Autun. The bishop was a French revolutionary. He wrote a lot on educational rights. And the gist of what Wollstonecraft was saying is, okay, if you talk about rights to education, or if you talk about the rights of property and so forth, why are these focused on men? Why are these limited to men? Okay, because for example, in Wollstonecraft's time and place, whether we're talking about England or France, not a lot of women were professionally writing. Not a lot of women were formally educated. Women could not own property in either of those countries. Okay. Same difference with the French Revolutionary attack on birth-based status. If you're really against aristocracy and the idea that noble blood somehow justifies the rule of aristocrat over commoners, if you're against the idea that somebody simply by being born into the right family, the aristocrats would say the right house, that they should have certain jobs available to them that are not available to commoners or anybody else. So, for example, one of the big deals of the French Revolution was that basically aristocrats who are some tiny, 1% of the population, I don't know if that's the actual number, but it's around 1%, were running the entire country. They were running the entire country. That's not an extremely precise way of putting it, but that's the gist of it, and that's what the French revolutionaries are mad at. So why should all those political offices, and remember here at the time, the church has also got huge political power in France, and a lot of the upper echelons of the church are being filled with sons from the aristocracy. Okay, so why are those political offices only limited to people of noble birth? and people from the middle classes, people from the lower classes, they wanted to know, why don't they have a share in political power? Shouldn't those positions be open to talent? That was one of the kind of catchphrases of the French Revolution. Okay, and Wollstonecraft is saying, yeah, that's all great. That makes total sense what you guys are saying, French revolutionaries. But why have you artificially limited it to men, basically? Why aren't you advocating for the rights of women to hold political office? Why are you putting gendered limitations on the right to vote? The right to vote, because in most Western countries, women couldn't even vote until the 20th century. That's true of the United States as well. Okay, so one way of seeing what Wollstonecraft is trying to do with the French Revolution is to say she feels two ways about it. She's saying the French Revolutionary slogan is about 2/3 right. So you remember the French Revolutionary slogan was liberty, equality, and fraternity. And she's saying, yes, French revolutionaries, you basically have the ideas of liberty and equality, correct? However, when you say fraternity, you literally mean fraternity. You mean a band of brothers. You mean boys only. It's like a club or something with you guys. That is weird because it's a contradiction to what you yourselves are claiming, which is that all individuals have these natural rights, that there are such things as the rights of man, and that the point of having a civil society, as Locke would put it, is to preserve those natural rights. So you need to stop artificially limiting equality and freedom to fraternity, and you need to take those ideals and extend them into humanity. Humanity which includes fraternity as well as sorority. Humanity which includes males and females, and you could extend this argument indefinitely, people of all sexes, all genders, and so forth. Although, as you've seen, if you started the reading, Wollstonecraft is really talking about two sexes. Okay. Wollstonecraft and our next author, Marx, believed that revolutions were vehicles of historical progress. And so you can see what Wollstonecraft is doing as an extension of the French Revolution, trying to push the French revolutionaries in a radical way concerning sex and gender. And you can see what Marx is doing, and we'll come to Marx right after Wollstonecraft. You can see what Marx is doing as trying to push the French Revolution to its most radical conclusions when it comes to class and labor. Okay. And the big idea for both Wollstonecraft and Marx is that revolutions were these vehicles and drivers of historical progress. These ideas of historical progress were nascent in 17th century Europe. You got just a glimpse of them with somebody like John Locke. So, for example, John Locke said that it's categorically better to live in a civil society than it is to live in the state of nature. You remember that idea? And you also got this idea that in transitioning from the state of nature to a civil society, things were improving because you got this new institution like government. Okay, so the idea is things that come later are generally better than the things that come earlier. And you get the idea that you move through this kind of linear development, this development along one line from one stage or state to the next. Okay, so ideas of, and as you saw, Locke didn't use the word progress. Wollstonecraft's going to use that word progress. Marx is going to use that word progress about a century later. Okay, so these ideas of progress are actually pretty new to the 18th and 19th century European situation. And this is just a side note. You notice the idea of progress was nowhere to be found in Plato. And that's not coincidence. Hardly, actually, I think I would be safe to say that nobody in the ancient world had this idea that you could categorically say that you could make an expectation, have a good bet that things that came later on the whole would be better than things that came earlier. 19th and 18th century ideas of progress anticipated 21st and 20th century ideas of development. So if you're having a hard time wrapping your head around this progress idea, just substitute the word development in there. It's a similar idea. The big difference is for the 18th and 19th century crowd, progress included moral progress and political progress. For somebody like Wollstonecraft, it was almost incontestable that having a more democratic or republican or a popular form of government was better than having an aristocratic or monarchical or more, she's going to call it middle age form of government. Middle age is sometimes called feudalism. We'll talk about that term more, especially with Marx. Okay, so there was a such thing as moral and political progress for Wollstonecraft. There was not any such notion of that moral and political progress, especially after the world wars in Europe. That really shook a lot of people's confidence, a lot of Europeans' confidence, let's say, in the ability of their societies to progress. Because what they saw was that instead of having more equality, they saw these brutal attempts at domination, for example, fascism. Instead of using technology to improve people's lives, technology was being used to start these endless and totalizing wars. Okay, so a lot of people started doubting that moral and political progress were possible, and that idea has only become more prevalent. That mood has only intensified, I would say, in certain parts of the West. And so the idea after those world wars was something like, well, maybe there's such things as progress, but the only real progress is economic or technological. So isn't it better if the per capita income of a country is higher? And isn't that kind of incontestable? And isn't it better that your computer has more gigahertz speed than, I don't know, megahertz speed? So just way fast computers versus way slow computers. And that's incontestable. This moral and political stuff, I don't know. I don't know if it really exists. I have my doubts, etc. So the idea in the 21st and the 20th centuries was, so we're not really talking about progress in the same way as the 18th, 19th century people were talking about progress. Let's just call it development, because what we're really talking about is economics, and development is more tailored to that economic sense of better and worse. Okay. For Wollstonecraft, as for Marx, progress had three big components to it. And this is the big idea of the second part of our class. Progress had a destination. For Wollstonecraft, let's just put the word in there. Emancipation is the destination of progress. Women's emancipation in particular. Progress also had a path. And as we've already seen from the bio, Wollstonecraft thought the path to emancipation for women was education, rights to education, and more broadly, women's rights. So that's the path. That's how you're going to get there. So the armed social movement, that was not really what Wollstonecraft was thinking about, although you have to suspect that that kind of mobilizing activity, mass mobilizing activity, played some part in what Wollstonecraft was thinking, because Wollstonecraft saw, oh, wait, women can do it for themselves. Okay, they can emancipate themselves. So I would suspect it had some influence on what she was saying. A large influence, actually. She didn't like violence, though. She was more of an educator. Okay, and then the last thing the ideas of progress have is the idea of obstacles in the path. And this, let's just put the word in here, oppression. Human oppression, but especially women's oppression. Okay. The Vindication. Okay, so this brings us to the question of women's oppression and women's rights. This is the big dyad for Wollstonecraft. That means these two things, she's always trying to think them together. And one is the obstacle, that's women's oppression, and one is the path forward, that's women's rights. Okay, what does she mean by these terms? Women's oppression and women's rights. This is more than just rhetoric for Wollstonecraft. This is more than just the slogan. There are concepts behind the slogans. There's concepts behind the rhetoric. Okay, first thing to note about rights. The Vindication is incomplete. If you've done the reading for today, you know there was an advertisement. There was an advertisement in this book, and it's included in our edition. And it basically says, sorry, reader, I planned this out to have two halves. The Vindication was supposed to come in two parts. You've got the first volume before you. The second volume was supposed to deal with legal rights and legal duties. But sadly, Wollstonecraft died early. She died shortly after giving birth to Mary Godwin, later Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. And she never got around to talking about the more formal aspects of rights, like constitutions, or how the government will enforce rights, or how the law system will deal with the enforcement of rights. She never got to any of that. Okay, so what we got instead, you know how I was saying Wollstonecraft's idea of politics involved morality and power. What we got was more of the moral side of it and less the side that would deal with institutional power. Okay, so she never got around to the discussion of legal rights or duties, at least in published form. Vindication of the rights of women relies on this term vindication. And the easiest way of translating it into 21st century English is just justification. When you were trying to justify a revolution in Locke, for example, you were trying to say that God was on the side of the revolutionaries and that God didn't want some tyrant figure destroying humankind that broke natural laws, etc. Okay. Similar idea with Wollstonecraft. Vindication meant in the 18th century a certain blamelessness before God, a clearing against suspicion. And you remember that quote from the YouTube video, the guy Wadpole called Wollstonecraft hyena in petticoats? And what he was saying was basically education had spoiled this woman, and you see her morals were loose. She had a child out of wedlock and all this. Okay, that's the suspicion. That's the suspicion that if women have rights, this is the license, the unseemliness, and the all the problems that will arise around the female sex. Okay, so that's the suspicion she's trying to clear. And yes, the God thing, the before God thing, is very important for Wollstonecraft. Very important. And we'll talk more about her religious views later. But the basic idea is these natural rights are God-given. And they're not just given to half the human species. God isn't stingy like that. Okay, so these are natural rights to freedom and equality that all people are supposed to have and supposed by the will of God. Okay, what's this idea of oppression? What's this idea of oppression? So Wollstonecraft uses the term oppression, and oppression was first appearing in the 18th century context in these challenges to social hierarchy and so forth. The easiest way to think about it is to use the term patriarchy. Patriarchy. So patriarchy prior to the 18th century, it hadn't been used in this 20th century way as talking about systems of oppression, that negatively impacted women, especially, but also negatively impacted men. Patriarchy prior to this 20th century usage, I mean, it's an ancient usage. It's in the Old Testament and so forth. It had more of a neutral meaning. It either referred to, hey, that's how things were back in the day, as in the patriarchs of old, phrases like that, or it was seen as just natural and God-given and just the way things were. So the idea of using patriarchy to describe household relations, to describe relations between kings and their subjects in a critical way, to say there's actually something wrong with that, and the presumption should be against patriarchy, that kind of thinking only starts with people like Mary Wollstonecraft. Okay, so what's wrong with it? What's wrong with the patriarchy? Why isn't it just this neutral thing? Well, Wollstonecraft has a very simple argument. It blocks the individual's development of themselves. That is the point of an education for anyone, Wollstonecraft would say. Anything which is limiting your potential artificially, which is an external restraint on how far you can go in this life and how far you can develop your reason and your mind and your morality, that is oppression. It just so happens there happens to be a system of oppression which has to do with the hierarchy of men over women, which is impacting especially women's opportunities to develop themselves. So patriarchy is supposed to be a system. It's a system of power. And what it does, wrongly, unjustifiably, is it blocks individual self-development. And those individuals happen to be women.